evening and hello. Thank you so much for attending tonight's event. Very grateful to be in the presence of everyone here tonight. My name is Jamal Jones, and I work at the University of Waterloo in the library as Associate Director of EDIA. I'm also currently in this role as an RA for this event under supervision of Dr. Burberry. And I'm really excited about tonight's event. Before we get into sort of all the stuff, just a couple things. Just a reminder that this event is being recorded. The Q&A portion will not be recorded though, just the conversation that's taken place so far. If you do need to use the bathroom, washroom, just sort of the way that you came in, up the stairs or up the ramp and to your left, that's where it's located. And if you need at any point just to kind of leave for whatever reason, lots of things happen in life, go do that. But there's also a prayer and meditation room on the 3rd floor, so if you need that, that's available to you too. So I'm going to begin with the land acknowledgement, and then we'll go from there. So we acknowledge the land on which we live and work today is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the treaty territory of the 6 nations of the Grand River, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Inuit people, and many more. Let this be a mindful reminder of the stewards of this land, its resources, and the care that Indigenous peoples have been demonstrated in many forms so that we could be here this evening. As we reflect on this acknowledgement, we're reminded that colonial systems of conquest and exploitation have not only dispossessed Indigenous peoples, but also have shaped the racialized oppressions of Black communities. The same structures that commodify land and labor through treaties and displacement also commodify Black rage. The Laundering of Black Rage is described by 2 Black and Rasul Mowatt, mirrors how colonial powers sanitized their theft of Indigenous lands through treaties that were often ignored or manipulated. Both processes serve to neutralize resistance, whether by erasing Indigenous sovereignty or commodifying Black resistance into marketable forms that devoid of transformative power. We're going to get into much more of that discussion later on tonight. Although Indigenous anarchist Clee Benally acknowledged that politicians can perform land acknowledgement or mark Indigenous Peoples' Day while simultaneously perpetrating and profiting from ecological devastation of cultural genocide, demonstrates the extreme dissonance of settler cognition. We also acknowledge that the act of speaking relations out loud may also be at times be considered an act towards the possibilities for reconciliation. This acknowledgement ties together this historical and ongoing impacts of colonialism on both Indigenous lands and Black resistance, while hopefully emphasizing meaningful action. So as I was kind of like thinking about this acknowledgement, I was reminded of a student that I met at Constable College who also studies at UW too. He invited me out for his capstone, and he delivered a poem called The Language of the Unheard. His name is Michael Reynolds, and with his permission, I wanted to kind of share just a part of it because I really thought it kind of tied both the conversation here tonight, but also to the Indigenous acknowledgement. So it starts, "We stand on this land, a land not ours to claim, where whispers of trees carry stories, older than the scars of steel and stone, older than the borders etched into the soil, older than the maps that rename rivers, hills, and lakes, a stolen land, a stolen people, and a fullness of truth that has yet to be revealed, taken from the first peoples, whose blood runs through the veins of the forest, whose air still rises with the morning fog, whose hands shaped this earth long before the ships of conquest arrived on shores, with false promises and cold chains." He describes, "And I, descendant of stolen Black bodies, ripped from the homelands across oceans so vast, so deep, they hold the memories of those who sank beneath waves and storms, forgotten by a world built on their bones. I too am tethered to this land, not by roots, but by wounds, by the myriad violence of stolen bodies and stolen earth, by the theft of their spirit, of soil, of soul, of stories rewritten in scarlet shades of blood, our histories reshaped to serve the oppressor's hand. 2 violences intertwined, 2 peoples displaced, one bound to land and one torn from it. Yet we both carry the weight of removal, of erasure." So, thank you, Micah, for that beautiful, beautiful poem. It goes on much longer, but it's just a snippet of it. Hopefully I can get that posted in the library very shortly. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Jamal. Thanks, Jamal. Hi, y'all. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for attending our lab event tonight. This is the 3rd event of the term for the Theorypractice Lab, a lab that I founded and co-direct with Dr. Craig Fortier that's focused on fostering spaces for all to engage with political education, build collaborative relations, and develop analytic tools and organizing skills towards diagnosing injustice and intervening towards transformative material change within our communities. Please be sure to pick up a lab zine and sticker and join our mailing list to get involved and hear about future in-person and online offerings. Before we begin our discussion, I want to thank all the people and grants that have made this event possible. Special thanks to Rashawn Young at the University of Waterloo, who graciously offered support from UW Black Studies, the Faculty of Health Teaching Fellows, the Canadian Association of Leisure Studies Connection Grant, and the EDIAR UW Faculty of Health Seed Fund. Finally, I'd like to thank our student volunteers, Mel, Jasmine, Arnie, and Shren. Also Wui, Guyana, and Marcus. Also Crazy Jerk Catering, our photographers, Yasmin and Dylan, the Kitchener Public Library, and finally, Jamal Jones of the UW Libraries, who has been instrumental in organizing this event with us. And now I'm beyond excited to introduce Black and Rasul Mowatt, authors of Laundering Black Rage, The Washing of Black Death, People, Property, and Profits. Black is a poet, organizer, and filmmaker, host of the Black Myths podcast, known for his writing in the Black Agenda Report, Left Voice, and Hood Communist, and his organizing to free the Pendleton 2. Rasul Mowatt is a department head and professor at North Carolina State University, who's renowned for his work critiquing geographies of violence and the production of public space, as seen in such books as The Geographies of Threat and the Production of Violence, The City and the State Between, and The City of Hip Hop. Thank you both for joining us. And I know that so many of us, especially after our lab's March study group on your writings, have been really looking forward to this discussion and for the chance to engage with you both. Okay. Okay, so let's begin. Obviously, laundering, very important concept to your book. In the book, you discuss the process of laundering to explain the ways in which the threat of Black rage is neutralized by the capitalist state, washed of its revolutionary potentials. So for people who aren't familiar with the concept of laundering, can you talk briefly about the process of laundering as it's typically understood, but then also how you reframe it within your own work towards understanding laundry as the logic of the state that works to perpetuate what you call white capitalism and its discontents?
Is the mic on? Or?
There is one other mic. Are you sitting on it?
This right here.
I'll pass
I'll
it.
just take this. Y'all hear me? All right. How y'all doing? Good. Briefly is always a challenge when they ask these questions. Yeah, I think it might be a little better to first clarify why we even cared to write this before we even explain laundering, or why this was even worthy of an observation or writing or anything. And then we can get into that. I'll try to be brief. So 2020, most of the book is not about 2020, but 2020 was a flashpoint for a lot of people, particularly when George Floyd was killed on camera, you know, with the knee on his neck for essentially 10 minutes long. And that obviously caused a lot of uproar and people in the streets. Some things we would call uprisings, other things were just protests. Some people were just outside. It kind of varies depending on, you know, who we're talking about. But initially it was someone who was killed by the police, and police killings of Black people and generally just white supremacy and other things of that nature are a problem in the United States, and a problem is an understatement. So there was a response, an enraged response, a response of rage to that. And we are studying Black rage in our book, in our scholarship, but it is important to note that we're not by any means saying that Black rage is the only kind of rage, that this is the only kind of rage that works within like oppressed communities. So there is rages of different oppressed communities in their own colonial context. So we're just studying ours because it has a specific history that we believe deserves rigor and deserves to be studied. And I think that could help inform others. So I just want to clarify that. So it began with the study of what we would say of conversion. So what we've noticed was, okay, people are out in the streets, at least stating that it's in response to George Floyd being killed. But then the solutions that are being offered to resolve issues in which people were killed by the police, particularly Black people, particularly poor, disabled, neurodivergent, Black males are killed by the police. When you look at the statistics, that's primarily who is killed by the police. Somehow the solutions to that were things that did not resolve the actual contradiction of that person being killed by the police. I was doing a talk last week and I used an example of just understanding contradiction. So if there is if you are hungry and you need food, but you do not have the ability to get the food, that is a contradiction, right? Like someone is hungry, there's food, they don't know how to get it. Now there's different ways to get the food. You might steal the food, you might purchase the food, but you don't have money to buy it. Or you just don't get the food and something, you might pass away, you get sick or something of that nature happens. So how do you resolve the contradiction of being hungry? Right, that becomes the ultimate question that we're trying to resolve. So if someone says, let's make a song about how hard it is to be hungry, right? Or let's go do a mural about being hungry, or let's arrest a hungry person, or let's pass laws so they can't talk about how hard it is to be hungry. But at no point do we ever deal with hunger, right? Like that is the fundamental problem. So, but then the question becomes, how does that conversion occur where we go from this person's hungry, they should probably eat too, let's make a song about it. Like how does that conversion occur, right? So the same thing in the United States where it's like, oh, someone got killed by the police, his knee was on his neck for 10 minutes. We should probably make sure something like that doesn't happen again. That just seems simple. But then all of a sudden it's like, oh, let's go buy Black. Oh, let's release a diversity statement. Oh, let's review our hiring, admissions or something like that nature. Oh, let's do all these things that do not resolve the primary contradiction that people were, at least appeared to be angry about or enraged about. So how does that occur? And how does it not just occur in general? What is the process that puts that in motion? And why are people generally signing off on it? Right, so how does buying Black resolve police killing folks? Right, and as we wrote in a later chapter, it effectively becomes a way you can buy someone out of a chokehold. Right. So how does that occur? That becomes the question. There's a lot more we could say in terms of all the evidence that we have, but that was the original observation. Like, and then we both at the time lived in Indianapolis, Indiana. He's now moved on, thankfully. But we're watching it in our own city, and cities is going to be an important part of understanding this concept. And we're seeing how, again, we saw young people go down out in the streets. Actually, prior to George Floyd, there was a brother killed called John Reed, who was killed in Indianapolis, and we're seeing young people go out in the streets for that, and then that rage gets caught up, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, let's make a mural for families who have been killed by the police, but the police issue doesn't get addressed. But the community rallied around it. Then an organization comes out of that, and all of a sudden, all this money and I say this as an artist, all this money that never came to the arts goes into the arts at the same time that people are breaking windows. Now you can do a painting on the window about how hard it is to be Black across the window that you once threw a rock through. It's interesting timing. So that's what we were trying to track initially. So the conversion, to understand the conversion, laundering became a means to understand said conversion. To talk about laundering, how people might primarily understand it. Anyone ever watched like Breaking Bad or Ozarks or Snowfall or The Wire or any of these shows? If you watch, I like to watch crime dramas. That's the thing. You'll always see in some of those shows, you'll see like a drug dealer or some kind of quote unquote criminal who, and we use Breaking Bad in the book. For those who haven't watched it, you have this weird white guy who's, failing at life basically, and he decides to sell meth. And he says he's doing it for his family initially, but he sells the meth and he realizes he's making so much money off the meth at some point that how is he actually gonna spend his money? You know what I mean? So it becomes a thing of he can't put that money in the bank. He cannot just, all he can do is pay rent and buy groceries. He can't go buy a property. He can't really do anything with the money because it's not considered clean. It's illegitimate money. So the process of laundering is, how do I legitimize my money? Or the definition is taking something that is gained illegally and making it look clean. So think about it. Laundering is something that is dirty and you are trying to make it appear clean, and it's an emphasis on appearing clean. It's never actually clean. So you're trying to relocate it where people don't know where the source of something is. That's typically how laundering is understood. For us, that definition has merit, but the categories in which it utilizes are not expanded enough. So it's basically saying that there is this legitimate system out there, and then there's these criminals outside of it who are trying to get into it. And it assumes that this system has no criminality to it, that it's fair, generally speaking, even if it has a little corruption or anything of that nature. But we're like, and I think it works even here in Canada, what makes Canada Canada? Like, what makes Canada a legitimate state? You know, what makes the United States a legitimate state? And was that gained in nice ways? Did someone come to this land and say, hey, we'd like to share it? Is that how that went down? Did somebody say, hey, we think we would like to unite everybody and it would just be a great country and it could be a melting pot? Like, is that how this country came to be? And I think most of us know that's not how it went down. So it was done through conquest. So capitalism, which is another essential part to understanding this, is not gain anything through just the free market or just exchanging of goods. It has to do it through violence. It has to do it through conquest. It has to do it through economic warfare, which is its own kind of violence. And in doing that, it has to legitimate the process. It can't just come in and just shoot everybody. One, it needs those people to work for them. So they can't subdue everyone by just putting a gun to their head. They have to create institutions and rationalizations and propaganda to justify the conquest. So the dirty in this sense is the actual conquest. It's all the terrible things that we probably know. And how do you justify that? How do you convert that over? You create these fronts, as we would say, within the laundering context, which is in our sense is the state. It is cities primarily that become the fronts that can convert the oppression into something. So we say there's an example Walter Rodney uses in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and he talks about sugar production in the West Indies and cocoa production in Africa gets converted to the chocolate industry in America and Europe. And that is done through slavery, that is done through conquest of land. So you can literally see it. It's not an abstract concept. By stealing, robbing, conquering, killing, etc., you convert those things into actual products that you then now can sell on a free market that have now been converted over, similar to how a drug dealer would convert their crimes as well. So now the slavery becomes the cotton, right? Now the conquest of land becomes private property that you can then sell and speculate on the market. These things are real. So then the rage, which we'll get to, becomes something that is in response to that process that you then have to figure out how to launder in the very same, not the very same ways, but in similar ways to subdue it. And then I'll come to Rasul in terms of thinking about it in terms of cities when we're talking about laundering, because you don't just do this in the abstract. You have to set up things on land. You have to create an actual site in which this happens. And then we were talking about it earlier today. When I was writing this, I think one day I was just looking out in the streets and I'm watching semis go up and down the streets. So I'm like, this is part of the laundering, because you're watching products move from one place to another, and that is in a capitalist production chain, and that is how you're watching it happen. So a lot of what laundering is not maybe what people are thinking in terms of just this kind of co-optive narrative, because that's usually the end of it. You know, but what is happening at all times, because that is what you have to figure out ways to subdue a population to run a state, to run capitalism, and cities become the hub to do that because you have a higher population density. You have the enclosures. You have a different distribution of labor. So I come to Rasul, want to say that because that's his more expertise, but that want to make sure that that gets underlined because sometimes that gets a little bit lost in the theory.
Before we go there, in terms of cities, just want to add
Yeah.
Go ahead.
briefly before but I think the other important point is even though 2020 is an inflection point, that was not a period of time in which we were thinking about a book. So we were just making important sort of field observations, and then we began to want to collect what we were seeing. So we still had not known that this was going to turn into a book, but more so a series of sort of things that needed to be noted. So going to cities where protests were happening and seeing sort of the changes of protests from fire and loitering to candlelight violin visuals, right? How did this transition happen? But another important point that is in our book is that there's two also things that occurred that's more tech related or on social media spaces. So in terms of Google search terms, remember in the summer, right after the George Floyd protests, the most searched term overall in the United States, at least, was black capitalism by black.
But So by black had never been searched more on Google search ever
before.
until post George Floyd being killed. You saw the highest amount of searches for by black. You saw the highest amount of searches for Black Wall Streets and related terms, right, that you could think of, in general.
Yeah, so that's an important sort of point that emphasizes how is it that people are thinking about that as opposed to police killings, the death of somebody, right? How is that possible? Why isn't the highest search term being the number of deaths, the number of police shootings, and something in that respect? And then the other thing that we have in our book is also the police tech industry shows always increases after each death. So in the sense of infrared goggles or,
Body cams,
tech boots, there's always a boost in investment of the stocks related to those industries after every single killing.
Every single high-profile
killing, yeah. So I just want to kind of give that framework, and then we can sort of go on to the next question.
Yeah. So as you're talking about this, I guess some of the questions that are coming up that we talked about too in our study group is, who owns Black Rage? How is Black Rage expressed and understood? And when does it then become dangerous to the state? And how does it become dangerous to the state to the point where it's laundered?
I think there's another question on the phases, so I'm going to try to split some of this up.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was rereading through our book today, and it's always interesting to reread your own work. And I don't mean this in an egotistical way, but sometimes it's actually kind of like, I don't know who wrote that. Like I'm not that smart, like ever. So it's just weird to see how you were in a certain state of mind. But yeah, I think one, this kind of gets to the later question, but thinking about Black Rage as not only this, but partly as a form of labor. So I think a lot of people think about it as a sentiment, as a kind of vibe, as just, I feel away. But our argument is when you actually are enraged, you actually do things, you go out in the streets, you create a certain kind of social capital that can then be exploited. And again, there's more to say on that later. So, but when we're thinking about capitalism and the means of production, whether we're talking about labor power, whether we're talking about technology, whether we're talking about, resources or raw materials and who owns those things, and then how the companies and the corporations, as we say, the white capital who owns those things can then produce wealth that's true on an economic lens, but it's also like if you want to actually express your rage through labor, you have to go through those same means of production. And if you were not able to seize those means of production, similar to if you're just thinking about a worker in general, then you are just selling your labor, right? That's why we understand You know, in a Marxist sense, at least, you're selling your labor to the capitalists for a period of time. And increasingly, your labor is always being commodified. When you think about your phones and all the pictures we take and all the information we give away, that's all labor in a sense, right? And what they say, because it's free, we don't think about it like that. So Black Rage becomes a kind of labor, and some people don't even realize they're doing it. And that can be anything from even the most useless thing of just posting something, or going and burning a building, or, you know, protesting, or whatever the thing is. It's something that becomes expressed that people act upon, but it's acted upon through the actual means of production that the capitalist owns. So therefore, the argument is that we don't really own our rage in that sense. Because if your rage is not able to seize those things, to then get to the other side to resolve why you are enraged, right, and why your people more generally are enraged, then you are not actually able to resolve the issue, and therefore you're just kind of selling it back to them. That doesn't mean you shouldn't contest with your rage, doesn't mean you shouldn't express it, but it's to say that ultimately, like we're coming back to the hunger issue, if I cannot resolve why this person is hungry, or why these people are hungry, or why they continually remain hungry, even if I gave them food today, they're hungry tomorrow, there is a certain process that puts that in place, and if you cannot intervene in that process, then you're basically just back on the market. Like you're unable to actually resolve the contradiction. So we say in the book, if you're not able, if labor, in thinking about it in this type of rage, is not able to expropriate some of that, or at least get some kind of concession that gives some power back to the people, then, you know, your rage just does not have that much power, generally speaking. That's why it has to be organized, just like we would say with labor in general.
And usually always the point that I have to come in to also remind people too is that rage is just this honest sort of response or reaction to the material conditions of others. And the others are not people who you're related to or you're connected to. So these are not your family members or your friends. You're completely disconnected. You're genuinely reacting to how unjust their actual living standards are in some particular way. That's why also too Black was using the hunger sort of example. So we're definitely talking about material conditions in which people are living in. And so the rage is you reacting to that. And of course, then it may become collective. And then that's maybe how it may turn into a protest, but exactly, it's not pristine, it's not perfect, it doesn't lead
It's pure.
It's not pure, it doesn't automatically lead to revolt or anything in that regard. The other particular point, so that before we move on too, is we have rage in sort of an opposition theoretically with violence, right? So those are two different things. You know, violence is something that is allowed by the state. Rage is not something that is allowed. So that's why then it is sort of taken over. So all violence is typically allowed. So when we do see it, even if it may look like, you know, an example of rage, it's being tolerated for some reason, right? And so that's also a point that we just want to make sure that it's not the same thing as violence, because I know that there's other sort of work that's out there that sort of
Makes it synonymous.
Yeah. And so we kind of disagree with some of that interpretation of rage from other people's work, especially white rage in particular. So
and it's like, you know, on the point of violence is not that I know this is being recorded, but it's not that violence isn't a part of it.
Yeah.
You know, and this is not an endorsement or a condemnation, but it's that violence is not synonymous. So when people think it's just this one kind of thing, and honestly, violence is not burning of buildings anyway. People have that kind of image of Black rage because you can't beat up property. It's not a person, right? So violence, you can't commit violence against property. But it's not synonymous with that because violence, just like rage, isn't inherently this revolutionary thing, right? You know, it's a tool like anything else, and depending on where you point that really dictates how revolutionary it is, right? So if I just point the gun at my family, that's probably not very revolutionary, right? Versus pointing it somewhere else.
that actually leads directly into the next kind of question I wanted you to talk about. In your book, you reference bell hooks and this discussion about this difference between a militant rage, which is actually radical revolutionary rage against the state, versus the potential for a narcissistic rage, which is more reformist, liberal, elitist rage that instead desires equitable integration into the state. And I'm wondering if you can kind of speak about how this narcissistic rage is potentially what limits some of the radical material change of rage and imposes these more liberal solutions that you talked about, like buying black, black capitalism, and charity that really fail to get at those structures.
Yeah, just a few things that are a little different than maybe how you described it.
Yeah.
Okay.
On the narcissistic rage, it's not that people who are going towards integrationist things are inherently that's inherently narcissistic rage, because it depends on what the kind of objectives and goals are. Because you might work at somewhere and have much more revolutionary ambitions, but you still got to work somewhere, right? So it's more people who, how she describes it is people who, black people who find their rage comes from a position of, I'm not getting where I want to go. And this kind of complements what Rasul is saying in terms of that's not really what we're calling rage anyway, because it's very much self-interested. That's where the narcissistic point comes in. So it's saying, I want to be the president to drop bombs on people, but I'm a black person, or I'm a black man, or I'm a black woman, but I deserve the opportunity to do that, right? I want to be the person to, exploit land and gentrify the community. Why don't black people have a shot at doing that? Why don't I get to be the one to do that? And it's very much like at my job, in my location, in my area, I am not given the opportunity to do what I want to do because they don't like black people, right? That is the narcissistic rage, generally speaking. Right. And then the militant rage is a communal sense of rage. That again isn't inherently revolutionary, but it at least is a consideration of other people besides just me and my family. It's like, okay, how can we actually change the world so the situation that we live in doesn't have the ability to, do what it's doing to us? Like, and that's the militant rage is looking to do that. So we make a class distinction here, because generally speaking, the narcissistic rage is people who live a little bit higher up on the totem pole and have more to lose, right? So if you say to someone who already is near the executive position that we should just destroy the system, they're like, no, I'm like one job away from making $200,000 a year. What you mean? Like, So we also use a Malcolm X reference when he talks about the house Negro and the field Negro. And then when you go listen to particularly the way he explains it in his speech, Message to Grassroots, he talks about how, the house Negro doesn't want to leave the plantation when it's time to escape. When he said when the boss gets sick, he says, we sick. He says the field Negro is like, if the plantation is on fire, he celebrates it. He's ready to leave, right? He's happy about it. So that analogy often gets used as a kind of just a racial thing, but what Malcolm is really making is a class distinction or a status distinction that exists in a sense that people with more access to power, even if they are in a marginalized position relative to the very top, people with a little bit more access to a better type of life are not as likely to want to give up that life as they move up the totem pole, generally speaking. People at the bottom have much less to lose, and therefore are much more open to the idea that this all can burn down, right? That's just generally how this works. So that's the different types of rage. When we talk about laundering, the process is how do you convert it from that more militant side to that more narcissistic side, but making it seem like it's still the militant side. So a lot of black elites posture like that's what they're gonna do, and a lot of black politicians, when they're in trouble in the polls or something, will placate to that kind of like racial grievance politics because they don't want to get voted out, or they don't want people to really pay attention to something terrible that they're doing to their own communities, quote unquote, because now it's like, oh, they're attacking black people, or oh, they're attacking the black mayor, or they're attacking the black president. So you saw this in the United States with Obama, where there were some criticisms that really were just racist, and they didn't have any merit. But then I remember when Obama actually left office and he was getting $400,000 a speech, and people started criticizing him for that. And then there was folks, well, y'all didn't say nothing when white people were getting $400,000 a speech, like that was that kind of thing. Well, it's like, well, I don't really think anyone should get $400,000 a speech, right? Like it's just kind of like one speech. We're not getting $400,000, a speech. And if we did, we don't need it. You know what I mean? Like that's so I'm saying there was this criticism of like you need to have a certain equality of oppression. There needs to be. So usually the black elite is criticizing a disproportionality, but it's to say if you were to even it out, then it's okay, right? Like if it was just all, like it's like to say in the United States, there's roughly 2 million people in prison. If all of those people were representative of the constituents of like equally, like there was just 13% black people and 65% white folks and 16% Latinos and so on and so forth, then it's almost to say that the prison industrial complex is okay, right? But because it's so many black people, then it's a problem. Like I saw a meme the other day where somebody said, they were describing people who say I'm socially liberal and economically conservative, and someone was like, explain that, and they said, it means I want the gay homeless person to die not because they're gay, but because they're homeless, So it's to say like you want a certain equality of suffering or a certain equality of oppression, but you don't necessarily want to eliminate oppression. Like we quoted Fanon in the Black Wall Street chapter, and it's to say effectively the process is the kind of integrationist black elite process, even at its best, is how many black people can we buy out of slavery? Not necessarily the question of how can we end slavery? Because during slavery there was a process where you could technically buy your freedom. It was very rare, but it could be done. So how many people can be bought out of slavery? How many can we give enough financial literacy to get out of slavery? Slavery is still okay, because some people probably deserve it anyway. Like that's the logic. It's just why do we have to deserve it disproportionately, right? So that kind of thinking is more along the lines of the kind of narcissistic rage.
And just one really quick point too, just to add in there, because just want to make sure people have an understanding too of why even bell hooks was even invoked, was that we were trying to do our due diligence again with trying to look for sources that spoke to Black rage. And so there's this book from the late 60s, early 70s called Black Rage that was completely useless.
Greer and Cobb.
It's more of like a sort of
psychoanalytic
piece that, it's completely useless, right? And so we found that there wasn't really a lot out there. So
the legal theory for Black Rage, actually.
Yeah, and so literally bell hooks sort of articulation in the essay is like essay.
It's in the book, Killing Rage.
Yeah, so it's not even like she's focusing in on that. It's just she's making this sort of observation and providing that sort of language, and then we found it to be useful because, again, it's not a studied area at all. But the key sort of piece of work that really did help to inform what we were looking at beyond 2020, but going back to the 60s and 70s, is Black awakening in capitalist America. So I just want to make sure that we sort of acknowledge that particular sort of piece of work, because again, the other work that's oftentimes heralded, which is Black rage, again, I don't know why I keep emphasizing it was worthless.
Yeah.
It was worthless. It was worthless. But let's move on.
Yeah.
Just to cite the book, I won't explain it, but we also use Anthony Bourdeau wrote a piece about social capital,
right. And
in that chapter too, there's a very quick, after we reference bell hooks, there's a synthesis of social capital, but I won't get into all that.
Yeah, so you keep mentioning Black capitalism, and I think you, chapter 6 of your book talks a lot about Black Wall Street. I'm not sure how much that's known in Canada, so it might be really interesting if you can talk a little bit about that history, because you kind of talk about it as almost the myth of this idea that people should aim towards this Black capitalism as a mechanism to save or move towards liberation. And I think that your chapter really debunks that.
Well, the chapter debunks it, but only because it's built upon the foundation of really good episode work of the Black Mist podcast, Two Black and his team, sort of putting together. But we did sort of talk before even that week, before even the episode, so we were trying to really frame that because, of course, I look at violence, right? But I want to try to answer that question in a different way that I think most people would think too. So I'm not going to jump straight to Tulsa Massacre. So think about Oklahoma. It's a widespread territory still. There's a massive land grab, literally. A gunshot is fired. People run into the territory claiming land immediately. So that is how Oklahoma is founded, at the turn of the century, right? It's madness, right? People staking plots of land without any rhyme or reason and so forth. So very rapidly, cities begin to form. Then they also found that the land is rich in oil, in particular oil on still sort of indigenous spaces that have been left, so what they say,
uninhibited
or whatever else. So just keep that in the backdrop that it's sort of uninhibited, right? So it's Oklahoma as an entire state, and then these cities within it are rapidly sort of growing. Tulsa is one of those major cities. So within a period of 10 years, you have a range of people who are moving in there, in particular, a lot of Black people from, Missouri and some other particular places are moving into this space. And so they're also part of this land grab. We have to acknowledge that, right? So there's a district that is sort of one of the major concentrations of Black people in Tulsa, right? It's not the only concentration of Black people, the only district of predominantly Black people, but it's one of the major ones because it's right close to downtown area. And so in 1921, well, actually 2 years before that, people were sort of acknowledging the violence of, Oklahoma overall, but Tulsa specifically, because they had lynched, a young white guy 2 years beforehand. So people already knew that there was a hunger or a capability of sort of engaging in this violence and it to be allowed. So anyway,
moral panic.
Well, yeah, and so it was very easily for lynchings to happen in the state of in Oklahoma by for anyone. So 1921, what occurs in this sort of pristine, sort of heralded area, where it really wasn't heralded at all, according to at least more official documents, besides the sort of subsistence of the people present there. No one ever called it Black Wall Street at the time, even though that's what, if you Google search, that's what you're going to come up with, Black Wall Street. There's no sort of evidence that it was called Black Wall Street or Negro Wall Street. Booker T. Washington comes to the state, but he does not come to Tulsa. So what he's actually referring to is Boley, Oklahoma, which is south of Tulsa, and that is more of a predominantly small Black city. So I know this is a lot, and it's different than sort of getting there, but I want to sort of frame the point how irrelevant, in a sense, Greenwood District actually is, even though it is built up in this now social consciousness in the present day. Then you get to the actual sort of census conditions of Black people in Greenwood. So what was it, like 90,
I think
95% of the Black people in Greenwood district specifically lived in subsistence poverty. So that meant that this was not a cornerstone of Black wealth, even though
no plumbing.
So this is also part of the myth of this particular location, but all evidence shows that's not the case. So the businesses that are there are produced by the hard labor and work of these everyday people, but also some Black capitalist exploiters of Black labor, right? So there wasn't a lot of jobs there, and so one young man in particular has to work downtown in Tulsa, and because of course segregation, he can't use the bathroom, and in the building that he is working in, he's working as
shoe shine,
like on the lobby level. or whatever else. So he goes to the building across the street or 2 blocks down, gets onto the elevator to go to the bathroom area, and supposedly a young white woman who was about to enter the elevator screams.
Actually, they said she was one that operated, because back
She
then,
was the operator? Yeah.
yeah, back then you didn't just get on the elevators. Someone had to operate it.
So she screams.
Yeah. Allegedly.
And mind you, she's not the one that files a police report either. So the scream is proclaimed or whatever else. He's arrested. And because, of course, what happened 2 years ago with this young white boy being lynched, people knew that it would be very easy for this young black man, Dick Rowland, to be lynched. Since it's 1921, this is also after World War I. And so many of
Red Summer.
Yeah, so one, there's already, race riots that are happening in other cities prior to this time period, but also there's a number of veterans, black veterans, that are living in the city. At this particular time, when black veterans were sort of, coming out of war or whatever else, they were always given their Army carbine rifle as a sort of memento or a gift for their service or whatever else. So they go downtown to protect Dick Rowland to prevent him from being lynched. It's semi-successful, but nonetheless, a crowd begins to form in opposition to these armed black men that are there. Ultimately, shouts and yells are sort of, taking place between these two crowds, and then, of course, a firefight ensues, which then resulted in slowly retreating militarily back to Greenwood District, because the crowd in opposition grows. Was it 75 to 1 in terms of the
Black to white.
Yeah, black to white. And so what ends up happening is they're overnumbered, and then they come into Greenwood and they begin to shoot everywhere, begin to set fire on things. Then the violence subsides, and then roughly around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning is when a rumor of
a whistle.
First a rumor of Boley.
They're coming from the other.
The black people from Boley, there was a rumor of the black people in Boley heard about what was happening in Greenwood District, and they were going to come up and to protect the people there. And so the white people who were in opposition, of course, to the armed resistance that was happening, came back and increased their level of violence. That then is what we sort of have an understanding of, where all the buildings are then finally completely leveled. So that provides a sense of the massacre itself. 10 years, at least 10 years after the massacre, Greenwood is completely rebuilt. So that's also oftentimes left out. So what we sort of see in terms of the sort of economic decay of Greenwood District comes in the 50s because of the interstate that's built, that's cut right through it. But it's not really until the late 70s, early 80s that a Black Wall Street sort of language is then applied to the Tulsa Massacre. It doesn't really intensify until maybe the late 90s, early 2000s, where then it becomes then this cornerstone folklore, which is then covered in more a little bit in a certain detail that's not in our book, but in the Black Men's podcast, where there's then no primary source evidence to talk about the actual economic conditions of this district. So everybody's citing either the same Broken Link website or some book doesn't exist. If you look for it in any particular library or in that respect, everybody sort of references these things. So everything from the bombs being dropped from the plane, no real evidence of that happening, all these types of things, right? And so what emerges then is a massive amount of literature, celebrations around it. So of course, 2021, becomes a 100-year anniversary. The year before, there's a ramp up of publications tied to Black Wall Street, both in terms of self-published as well as published by, different presses. A range of books. Some of the books are children's books that are talking about black capitalism, how to count your money and save up to build your own Black Wall Street. You know, so yes, young man, you can build Black Wall Street, you know, just by saving up. And then as well as sort of, you know, memoirs, novels, all these things are being mass produced. Like literally you can sort of see, you know, there might be 4 or 5 books, you know, back in the 80s, 90s, maybe 3 more, you know, early 90s, and the next thing you know, it's 100 books, right? And then there's websites, and then there's campaigns. Some of the campaigns are debit cards, which is the one that we always love, which is a debit card can bring back Black Wall Street. So I'm not sure if you know how debit cards work. They can't even help us pay for a movie tonight. So, you know, and, you know, but the point is that everybody's cashing in on the sort of mythology of it, but the emphasis is not on, which is why we're using it in the book, not on the armed resistance to protect the life of somebody whose life was going to be threatened. The emphasis is on the myth of an allure of something that didn't even exist in this case. It's not even an exaggeration of something that was there. It did not exist in the way that people have created it, and it's now its own thing that lives and lives and lives and will probably never die, because now people also then want to create Black Wall Street in other places, not just in the United States, but also Black Wall Street in other countries that, you know, where other concentrations of Black people are at, whether it's in Nova Scotia, whether it's, you know, in Berlin, whether it's in London, it now becomes invoked in that particular way. There are some actual real places that were called Black Wall Street, but they were nowhere near Oklahoma. So for example, there's one in Durham that was literally really called actually Black Wall Street by the people there. And so I just want to kind of provide that context, but in a very particular different way. The other final point too is that, again, going back to the wealth of Tulsa, including the black capitalists there, with oil. If you all remember the Martin Scorsese film, Killer Moon, right? That is the same time period. So most of us, when we think about history, we don't think about things that are happening simultaneously. This is happening not only simultaneously, but happening in the same city, right? Happening in the same location. So if we're talking about wealth that's being generated and certain people who have wealth, there's only a few places that people are getting wealth from, right? There's only certain types of industries that they're building wealth, regardless of who they may be. So I just want to sort of also give that context.
Yeah, I don't really have much more to add to that. Yeah, I guess just thinking about it in terms of, like you spoke to the history, but just like, I guess a little bit more about how amped up it's been. Like it really gets amped up more prior to even, because when I had written an essay, we did a podcast and I wrote an essay about it because we had so much research from the podcast. But when we wrote the chapter, we just reworked that essay mostly. Probably didn't keep much of it. So I was trying to get a better understanding of like what made it popular. Because it was like I think the essay originally just started with 2020 and just acknowledged it was popular. But there is
TV shows.
There was like 2 different strands that we found. Really was like there was a kind of pop culture side, but then there was a more grassroots side that I think was misguided. But it was due to this kind of understanding, speaking on the grassroots side, that there was this black history that there was this black town that all the black people owned everything. And they had their own businesses and white people didn't bother them at all. And it was self-sustaining and it was able to exist.
The dollar circulated. Yeah,
the dollar circulated 100 times, whatever that even means. And before it left the community, and it was a utopia. It was a Wakanda, right? Like that.
We're not joking. They've actually.
Yeah, you go down there to Tulsa now, and they'll say that kind of shit. Like, excuse my French, but like Wakanda. So it was this glorious place that had long lost, that we had lost because we were living on our own, nobody was bothering us, and then white people got jealous, and they took it from us. And that's the way I learned it in folklore. Like I actually had an art teacher, that was the first person I ever told me, he was a black art teacher, and he told me, you ever hear about it? I was like, no. It's like, yeah, they had their own planes and they had their own buildings. And, you know, I'm like, really? And I'm like in like 10th grade. You know, I'm like, wow, like really, where is this, right?
Yeah.
And like you said, there weren't any real books to read about it. Like it was so just something that people said. And then when YouTube came around, people started making videos based on baseless information or a few pictures that they could find on Google and whatever. And it just kept rolling and rolling and rolling. And then people who were even supposed to be scholars and historians were repeating this. So you can understand why black people in the United States who like realistically and truly have been denied a lot of our history, haven't been told of some of the more quote unquote positive things we've done. So that becomes its own kind of industry. That's why we say it's laundered, because it becomes this kind of recovery kind of industry. Like we can go back to this previous era, and that's why it's like, oh, we need a Black Wall Street. But like to Rasul's point, that place never really existed. What it was a few blocks, the way you would maybe think about a strip mall, if that. And it was a few blocks in a broader, like 35, 40 block neighborhood. And it was a few blocks, there was a business district that was able to, you know, service black people who lived in that area because black people weren't allowed to shop in other areas. So a lot of what people are celebrating as black capitalism is just a consequence of segregation. It creates an inadvertent market or a monopoly for a few black capitalists to serve black people because other businesses are not allowed at the time to even do it. So yes, it's going to be a grocery store or a barber shop or whatever. And then as integration has occurred, a lot of those businesses have disappeared because they are basically and effectively small businesses that can't compete with big capital. So that's why it's interesting as people are talking about this black business stuff, you actually look statistically, black businesses are getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and a part of the economy, so much so, as we referenced in the book, I think black businesses make up about 0.3% of all receipts in the United States. 0.3%. So it effectively has no real impact on the economy as much as it's been gassed up. But it was this big deal growing up, and I always I don't want to say always, as I got to a certain age, I was like, but I never really looked into it. And then as we actually got around to it, it was like, yo, this is totally not even close. You know, like most of the black people that lived in that neighborhood worked for white people. They didn't work at these black businesses. They worked because it was an oil town, oil boom, and part of why there was so much rampage against, you know, lynching people, and it was first a moral panic about criminals in general, and before it was even, and then black people obviously became the face of it later on, was because the oil boom had started to go down. So there was a drop in profits, so people were getting laid off, and it's easy for capitalists to kind of direct that rage, the white rage in this sense, to the, you know, the black folks or whatever. But on that day that it happened, it was not about, oh, we just finally realized that this place that's been here for years has all these black businesses, let's go burn it down today. Like, that's not how life works. Like, no, they wanted to lynch somebody. Black men came downtown, tried to stop them. They actually came downtown twice, tried to stop them. And then that is what inspired the burning of this neighborhood. So, but somehow black resistance is left out of it. So that part I didn't even really know about. It was just more like, man, they burned this town down because they were jealous, you know? So you have a lot of people trying to rebuild something, but as we say, to return back to that is to return back to segregation. You can't separate the context in which something is born. You know, so the black business doesn't occur, whatever black businesses existed, they don't come out of the blue. Like I said, they come out of a certain arrangement of labor and capital at that time, right? So that's the part that I think is most astonishing, is even people who I think have goodwill gas it up. And then so as the community is gassing up, eventually people who either come from that community, come from black communities in America, come from those neighborhoods, they get jobs at some of these places. Some people write about it. Ta-Nehisi Coates brought about Tulsa in terms of reparations in his reparations essay. And then, what was his name? David Lindbergh, who does the show The Watchmen, decides on HBO. Lindoff, not Lindbergh. We were talking about Lindbergh earlier, but David Lindoff does a show. He said it was inspired by reading Coates' essay, and he converts The Watchmen into this idea that what if black people got reparations for Black Wall Street, for Tulsa, and then HBO puts out this idea, or puts out this graphic novel with The Atlantic, Atlantic magazine about the massacre, and it's becoming this educational thing. So then more people bandwagon on it. And by 2021, Joe Biden, in his policy, one of his policy proposals is to rebuild black wealth. And he says we want to rebuild Black Wall Street. It's in an actual memo. Like, that's how ridiculous it became, right? So, but it's to show there's a collaboration, not just with the quote unquote state doing it, but it's also a collaboration with people who are getting bad information, who have a certain desire, I think, genuinely to want to rebuild things that, you know, or to want to build wealth. And then there's also, lastly, a parallel track of just buy black in general is also happening around the same time. There was in 2015, we know about how the Nation of Islam had a thing about justice or else, and the or else was we're not going to buy products at these companies if they don't solve what racism or something of that nature. You see it today. They eliminated certain companies in the United States eliminated DEI programs. So now it's like, oh, we're not going to shop at Target. And then going back to my point earlier, like, even if Target has DEI programs, like, Target still is Target. Like, it's still a corporation. If you work there, you still don't make a lot of money. You know, they still have cheap labor. Like, it's still, like, it doesn't rearrange that. And plenty of black people work at Target if you go there at night when people are stocking the shelves. You know, so the only DEI programs they're complaining about is a few black businesses. So just to say, like, there was a movement that I think people genuinely were trying to do, but the way that even that can get caught up in the laundering process. So laundering isn't always people trying to do dirty things or mean things on purpose. They actually think they're doing something well, but once it gets captured in this process, it becomes something to actually be used against the people.
Thank you. I think one last question, maybe just from me before we open it up to the audience. Clearly, you're critiquing black capitalism or buying black, and even some of these other kind of acts you mentioned as superficial acts like yard signs and street paintings, street name changes, these kinds of things. And instead, you talk a bit about collective organizing and even the idea of reverse laundering, specifically talking about flipping the bribes of the capitalist state to instead fund anti-colonial, anti-imperial measures that it so right now religiously outlaws. Could you talk a little bit about the potential for that kind of reverse laundering or the flipping of the bribes as leading us towards some kind of collective organizing or praxis?
So just make sure I understand the question. So you want me to talk about, I got the second half more so, but the first half you want me to talk about black capitalism, and then you want to talk about the way to reverse launder, things like that?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
So you're critiquing black capitalism, and you critique black capitalism, and then you talk in the book about the potential for reverse laundering towards something different, right? So it's not black, we're not heading towards black capitalism, we don't want to head towards buying black only, those types of things. So what does reverse laundering mean if we're going to flip those towards something that's about collective liberation?
Yeah, so on the buy black part is a way to connect this, because this is at the very end of the Black Wall Street chapter. We actually said something about this, because I remember rereading and I was like, we're really going hard on this. So I was like, let me put a little bit of, just a little nicety in there at the very end. So Huey P. Newton, who was the co-founder of the Black Panther Party in October 1966, he had written, I think he wrote a piece, it's in his Huey P. Newton Reader, it's what we referenced. I think it was called Revisiting Black Capitalism. But his point was sometimes we can get, those of us who call ourselves socialists, anti-capitalists, whatever we call ourselves, can go a little too hard on bashing black capitalism or just people's efforts to try to do something in our kind of, hatred of capitalism. Sometimes people catch strays. So he was saying that at the core, he started thinking about it dialectically, is for people who mean well, at least, and who are, people who are in communities, is a core of trying to muster some kind of self-determination. And we've been told, because we live under capitalism, that best way to muster it is to own things. And that's not incorrect, technically, if you're thinking about how you can best have some kind of control. The best way to do it is to be a capitalist. It's just that in doing that, you are also going to dispossess other people and exploit other people. That's just the contradiction that it presents. But he was saying you have to deal with the positive to overcome the negative. So he's saying that you want to tap into the self-determination aspect of people who pursue those kinds of things. So for instance, if somebody is a Black business owner in a community, how can you get them maybe to donate to certain community donate their proceeds to certain community efforts that actually do engender more self-determination, and by working out that kind of program, eventually the capitalism becomes irrelevant, it's no longer needed, and then people just move on, right? That was this kind of argument he was saying, as opposed to just saying, hey, you're a Black capitalist, F you, go to hell. Like that, in organizing, that actually won't work. I can attest to that. If you approach people that way, that won't work. You have to work through contradictions with people. You can't just say, hey, you're a capitalist pig, get out of here. Like that just doesn't hold up. I mean, now if it's like Target or something, you can say that. But I'm saying but if it's just some little mom and pop, like, whoever made the jerk chicken out there, and you're like, you capitalist, Black, like that doesn't really. So sometimes that's what he was getting at, is like, if that's how you approach it versus, hey, can y'all make the food for the event, and maybe you can come and learn about these things and we can work through those contradictions. If you're trying to organize, that's more so what we're trying to work through, as opposed to just F you. That's more for when you write the book. So it's like reverse laundering. We put that at the end of the book primarily because some of that is things to be said off camera. But I'll say in the sense of that example of Black capitalism, or generally speaking, I always tell people, capitalism talks about what's called surplus value, right? So that is, the amount to simplify it for people to not get into a big economics class. If you do own a business and you put $100 into it and you get $200 back, that's the surplus. That's what we would call the profit, right? You made $100, right, out of that. So if you pay somebody this much money, there is a surplus that you get back, because you're not going to pay people literally the amount of money you get back. You can't make profit. That's why it's exploitation, because the people don't get their full sense of labor. So in that surplus that you have, where does that surplus go? Where does that profit go? And does it just go back in your pockets? Or do you find a way to put that back into the community, put that back into efforts that reverse the process that we're describing, that actually do fight capitalism? And sometimes you might have to engage in certain of those things to do that. I don't want to get into a bunch of international stuff in terms of, like, if you look at countries like China and things of that nature. I know there's debates on that. But what can't be argued is that a country like China had to engage in certain kind of market capitalism, but also has a pretty strong state that was able to reinvest that money in their country. So they didn't just become a bunch of poor laborers. They were actually able to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty doing that, right? So it's like to say, on a much smaller scale, reverse laundering, just to break that down, is taking something that is legitimate to fund something that is illegitimate, or to resource something that is illegitimate. And what you find illegitimate is going to be the thing that the state does not condone, right? So that doesn't have to mean it's some secret paramilitary thing, just for the record. It can be that, but it doesn't have to be this kind of weird spy movie shit. It can just be the program that doesn't get funded for poor kids who need breakfast. It can be a very boring thing like that too. It doesn't have to be this like extra extraordinary thing. But it's illegitimate in a sense that we don't want to feed children, right? The state, I'm saying, doesn't want to feed children, so how do we find a way to feed children? No one's taking care of our needs. Our needs are not seen as legitimate, hence why they're not being met. How do we meet those needs, right? How do we meet those material conditions? It can grow into something more than that, but it needs to start there at actual material conditions first before you go do any other adventurous things. If you don't deal with people's material conditions first. But the reverse is like, since we say reverse because you are being paid at a job, you are engaged in capitalism, you might be over a budget, you might be able to seize a budget, like, the Black Panthers used to go up to businesses and actually be like, if you don't pay up for our breakfast programs, this business may not be here tomorrow. Like that, something might happen to it. That really did used to happen. If you don't, this church may not be here tomorrow if you don't pay up for our breakfast programs. Like it was that was if after they asked nicely, right? So I'm saying that's the kind of reverse laundering that could be done. That can also be in a negative way, like the United States. We use this example if anyone's familiar with Iran-Contra. It's a scandal. The United States sold guns to Iran, used that money to then fund dirty wars in Nicaragua against the communists. But that was not like congressionally authorized, and that's why it was a scandal. So that would be another type of reverse laundering.
Not too much, because I know we want to get to questions from you all. Just really, really briefly, I know you said in terms of the sort of strong arming of the Black Panther Party, but again, emphasize two particular points. One, collective action, and secondly, organization. So creating organizations. So this is not an individual act that can be done. This has to be done in concert with other people with the intent of sort of, again, addressing a material condition.
That's important.
And so when we think about let's say the free breakfast program, there are two ways in which they were able to get food and in these particular sort of cases, or the sort of food pantry, right? They would get donations, from businesses that saw themselves as supportive of many of the sort of causes, right? The other part is that people worked jobs and they just took portions of their check and purchased the food, right? So instead of sort of seeing themselves as some type of electrician activist, teacher activist, custodian activist, whatever else, they just simply
gave money to
job during the day.
Gave us an order.
And when their check came, they took a portion of their check and purchased food collectively to stock up the shelves. So those were the two combinations in which we would see. So when we see those pictures of, again, the food on the table for the breakfast program, or the bags from the pantry and so forth, just to think more directly of how that got there, that's from, and those are some examples of reverse laundering, because that's not what you're supposed to use your job for, at all, right?
Yeah.
You're supposed to use it for yourself, and again, coming back to the state. So let's go ahead and get some questions for you all.